I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their ancestors and elders past and present. My name's Renee Kramer. I'm a Yuin woman and a mum and the Deputy CEO at Community First Development. I'm so excited to be here today and joining this wonderful panel of speakers who are just absolutely deadly to talk about, on our terms, Indigenous women defining economic power and self-determination. So it's going to be a lovely discussion. I'm really, again, thankful to you all for joining us, and I will take a seat. We're going to keep it really relaxed. This morning I will talk us through the session, formally introduce each of our speakers. We'll move to a brief yarn and get into some of their expertise and perspectives on the topic, and then we'll be looking to you for some questions. So whilst we're going, start thinking about the different things that you might like to engage on with our speakers, and we'll look to wrap up between 1 and 1:15 so that everybody can duck out and grab some lunch. So again, thanks so much for joining us. We know it is a side event in a break, so hoping you're all having a great Women Deliver so far. So on our terms, Indigenous women defining economic power and self-determination. Indigenous women across the Oceanic Pacific are building economic futures on their own terms. Yet conversations about economic power, who controls resources, makes investment decisions, and defines what prosperity means, often exclude Indigenous women's leadership and perspectives. This session shifts the focus. We're co-hosted by the Research and Development Impact Network, the Australian Council for International Development, and First Australians Capital. We'll bring together Indigenous entrepreneurs, young leaders, development practitioners, researchers and government reps to explore what economic empowerment looks like when Indigenous women across generations define it on their own terms. From Australia to the Pacific Islands, Indigenous women are building businesses and creating economic models that honour cultural protocols, prioritise collective and intergenerational well-being, and challenge conventional frameworks and power imbalance. Yet, it does say they, but I'm going to say we, remain at the intersection of multiple systems of exclusion, navigating power dynamics that weren't designed with our values or our contexts in mind. The question isn't whether Indigenous women can lead economically. They already do. The question is, are international development governance systems and policies ready to genuinely support that leadership and promote it as best practice across the region? So we are joined today by 4 incredible panellists, and I'm so delighted and honoured to be joining you. So we have Jess Walters, who is a Palawa woman from Tasmania, an Indigenous research manager at Monash University. Jess is also a PhD candidate exploring the integration of climate science and industry knowledge within environmentally resilient sectors. Jess serves on the Australian Government's First Nations Clean Energy and Climate Change Advisory Committee, bringing a strong local perspective alongside experience working across international contexts. Her work is grounded in family ties to forestry, agriculture and aquaculture, shaping a deep commitment to environmental and climate security. Drawing on expertise in earth science, international relations and Indigenous research, Jess aims to advance just transitions for rural and Indigenous communities. We also have Alice Tamar, who is a Darug woman and the Managing Director of Connecting Cultures International. She brings extensive experience working with Indigenous communities across Australia and internationally. Alice has led the development of First Nations engagement frameworks for international development programs and serves as a technical advisor on a number of DFAT-funded initiatives. She is also a co-founder and committee member of the Association of First Nations Australians in Development. Alice has designed and delivered Indigenous knowledge exchange projects across the Pacific and South Asia, supporting collaborative, community-led approaches to shared challenges. Alice's work is grounded in her commitment to cultural safety, locally led approaches, and equitable inclusion. She has worked across all levels, from grassroots community to diplomatic and ministerial engagements, with a strong focus on amplifying Indigenous leadership, breaking down structural barriers, and fostering cross-cultural connections. We also have Elaine Jolliffe, who is an executive leader with over 20 years experience across economic development, regional development, public policy, and strategic engagement. Elaine works at the intersection of government, industry, and community, focusing on how economic systems are designed, communicated, and delivered. She has led complex organisations, delivered large-scale programs, and shaped policy and advocacy across government, industry, and the not-for-profit sector. Her expertise spans governance, procurement, program delivery, and cross-sector partnerships. Elaine is known for translating complex systems into practical, place-based outcomes that strengthen economic participation, leadership, and long-term structural change, particularly across regional and remote Australia. We also have Cici Koalala, who is a dedicated advocate for disability rights and inclusion, with extensive experience in education, policy development, and program management. With a strong academic background, including a double master's in strategic human resource management and commerce from the University of Wollongong, she has built a career focused on empowering marginalised communities, particularly persons with disabilities. Currently serving as Manager for Inclusive Development at the Pacific Disability Forum, Cici works to advance the rights and full participation of persons with disabilities across the region. She has previously held roles at the Fiji National University, where she led disability services, ensuring accessibility and inclusion for students. Her leadership extends to governance roles, having served as President of the United Blind Persons of Fiji, Secretary of the Fiji Disabled People's Federation, and Treasurer of the Pacific Disability Forum. Can we give our speakers a clap just so? Wow, how lucky are we? All right, so again, thank you so much for joining us for this yarn today. And Cici, I'll start with you in our first round of questions about defining economic empowerment. From your work with the Pacific Disability Forum, what does economic empowerment look like for women with disabilities when it's defined by them rather than by outside programs or institutions?
Thank you, Renee. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to just explain about some of the work that we are doing at the Pacific Disability Forum. First of all, with all protocols observed, I would like to acknowledge the leaders of the land that we are currently on, both past, present, and emerging. For Pacific Disability Forum, we are a regional organization made up of 47 OPDs and 26 service providers and individuals who are interested in disability advocacy work, who come from 22 countries and territories around the Pacific. So talking about economic empowerment for women with disabilities and for persons with disabilities. When it is done properly, it is a project where it is led by women with disabilities themselves from the beginning right to the end, from the design of the program to its implementation, monitoring, and the evaluation stage. Only then will it be successful, or we can say that it will be inclusive of what they really need. For persons with disabilities, most of our persons with women with disabilities are living in rural and in maritime islands where they do not have access to proper financial services or institutions such as banks. Sometimes they do not have reception to access e-wallets, and it's quite difficult for them to have these mechanisms to be able to have businesses. But first of all, most of them do not have simple financial literacy knowledge and skills. So that is one of the barriers or one of the challenges that keeps them from building economic backgrounds or businesses or something that they can use to earn money for their families. One of the ways that we go through this is by giving them this financial literacy training. So we do go out to the OPDs and we get them to select members from their different constituencies to come in and attend these literacy trainings. Simple things about how they can budget their money, put aside money that they can use and money that they should be saving. Sometimes the concept of saving is quite a new concept for most of them. Most of them, whatever money they get, they spend it all straight away. So by the end of the day, there is nothing left. So even the simple concept of saving $10 from a $50 voucher from the government is quite a something big for most of them. And this is one of the skills that we try and inbuild or train them to understand. The second thing that we try and help them with is to see how they can use what is around them to try and earn a living from. So for most of our women, like I said, some live in maritime areas, some live in rural areas where they are close to the rivers. So when we are helping them, we try and make them understand or identify ways where they can earn some money. So maybe selling grog or planting grog and selling them from their plantations, or planting vegetables and then selling them at a side market. Some of them want to do piggery farms or poultry farms. So just using something that is around them that they can easily access and work with their families to earn money. And one such project that we did, that we embodied this, was we worked with ACFID after COVID, trying to understand or get people to recover after the pandemic. So we got them to do business plans on what they wanted to do or how they wanted to do their businesses. And then we gave them seed money to try and help establish their small businesses, which most of them are still currently running today. I think that's
fantastic.
I can go on about stuff.
Yes, I think we go. Thank you, Rita. Jess, your work focuses on climate, environmental change, and just transitions. How do these issues affect Indigenous women's economic opportunities at different stages through their lives, especially in rural and remote communities?
Yeah, no, thank you, and hi everyone. Thanks for having me. So I am from a very small town. I live in one now, and I've worked in very remote areas around the world. But I think there's two sides that I kind of look at in terms of as Indigenous women. I think firstly, it's a very practical lens, which is the fact that a lot of rural women, Indigenous women that live in rural communities that are involved in industries that are really at the forefront of climate change and really facing those challenges associated with climate change. And so you've got your agriculture and those kinds of industries. And so women are who work in those industries are really having to go through a transition of employment and economic development themselves. Also then we're seeing a lot of stress placed on Indigenous families that are involved in those industries because a lot of people can't work and things like that. And then the other side of it too is the cultural challenge as well. And as Indigenous women, you know, it's really up to us as nurturers and as, you know, the heart of the home that we have to pass down our knowledge to future generations. And of course that means, you know, caring for the country and things like that. And I think as we're dealing with climate change, it's evident more than ever that we should be caring for the country. And so I think when I talk to a lot of Indigenous women, when I go out to communities, they do feel a lot more pressure in a sense of passing down that knowledge and trying to really embed those practices into their children and their community because, you know, even out in some of the communities out in the outback, they're dealing with 50-degree heat, you know, and it's just unimaginable. And so they're having to really try and care for their country, but then of course they're coming across challenges associated with different, you know, legal and land management issues and things like that. So they can't always practice what they want to practice in terms of land management. And I think a lot of younger generations are also finding that now where they want to pass on their knowledge and they want to conduct their ways of doing, but it's not always allowed to be done, which is quite frustrating. And I think Indigenous women, it is adding more of that pressure. But I also think there's a really exciting opportunity for Indigenous women in terms of holding that knowledge. And in terms of economic development, we're seeing a lot more job opportunities related to land management and sustainability and things like that. And so having Indigenous women in those roles is providing that economic boost for them. But then again, whether the pathways are there to support Indigenous women going into those roles is another thing. So that's kind of my view.
It's a very valued view. Thank you. So, Elaine, you've worked closely with Aboriginal businesses, traditional owner groups, and regional communities. What are the biggest barriers Indigenous women face in building economic power in regional and remote Australia?
From what I've seen, it's not about capability. Our women definitely have capability. In regional and remote contexts, our women are already leading communities. They're leading businesses, whether formal or informal, you know, and trying to create their own local economies. But it's only when they step into, you know, institutional or formal systems, that's where the barriers lie. Things like access to capital, market access, procurement policies and standards, you know, scale over knowledge. That's what creates the biggest barriers. It's those systems that are being designed by others, mainstream, that think they know best, are the biggest barriers. You know, I worked with a woman in regional WA who had local knowledge. She had an amazing business. A government contract came up. With government contracts come the complexities of the procurement systems. Now, this contract was designed essentially to cut out local knowledge, cut out local First Nations businesses and get someone else in that was non-Indigenous from, you know, 700 kilometres away. And, you know, it pretty much counted her out even before she had a foot in the door. So despite having the capability, you know, she was immediately locked out. And honestly, it's not just about that one contract. We see it time and time again with the systems that, you know, our women have to deal with on a daily basis. What's also reinforced that is a bit of a shameful plug for work, but First Nations Economics has done some research with the University of Sydney, and we've looked into the policies around economic participation, especially for women and First Nations women. And what we found is that firstly, there realistically aren't any First Nations women or segregated out. And there are just barrier upon barrier upon barrier, so stacked tenfold to disable, First Nations women economic participation. So, in a nutshell, I don't think our women are lacking capability. We need to change the systems. We need to change the policies and the systems, and I'm not, saying anything that we already don't know.
Absolutely, thank you. And I can see my colleagues in the back there nodding away furiously. They're on the ground every day out in community. We map the assets. We know that communities have the solutions already, and they've got so much strength that already exists. So I couldn't agree more. And I'm sorry to hear about that story, but I agree so wholeheartedly. We shouldn't have to continue to pretzel ourselves into a system that we have no say in developing. And looking over at Alice nodding furiously through that whole response. Through your work on First Nations frameworks and Indigenous knowledge exchange across Australia and the Pacific, what does economic power look like when Indigenous women define it on their own terms?
Yeah, thank you, Renee. Yeah, I think it's something I see through my work a lot. Like I run my own business and working, I think, focused on First Nations engagement and knowledge exchange and connecting Indigenous peoples across cultures. I get the opportunity to meet a lot of amazing Indigenous women in many different contexts who are self-determining in their own ways. And, whether that's through business or it's community leadership or other forms of economic participation. But a common thread that I often see across these very different contexts is women speaking about the importance of being able to work in ways that align with their values, that prioritise family and community and cultural practices, and to define success in our own terms. And there's a strong sense that economic power is collective and tied to community wellbeing and our future generations. And I think that really resonates with my own experience, because for me, a big part of economic power is having choice, and having the financial means and flexibility to be able to decide what opportunities I do take up and who I work with as well. Because before running my business, I didn't always have that level of choice and control. But now I really like that I can be a lot more intentional, and when looking at pieces of work, I can ask, is it aligned with my values? Is it going to have a meaningful impact, and will it benefit not just me, but broader community as well? And I think that's incredibly important because it also opens up opportunities beyond the work that you're doing. And like you mentioned before, I'm one of the co-founders and committee members of the Association of First Nations Australians in Development. And we're really focused on creating a safe space for mob that are working in international development to connect and learn from each other, to advocate for better practice within the sector. But it's a volunteer role, and it's something I think that I feel very lucky to be able to have the flexibility to be able to contribute so much time to it now. And I think for me that's really important because it's a broader part of a responsibility I feel working in this sector and connecting with communities. So I think in that sense, economic power is not just about earning, it's what about earning can enable, and having the time and resources to show up for community and invest back in that. And I think at the same time we're operating in systems that are often dominated by large non-Indigenous organisations, particularly in international development. And I find that really challenging because they've got very different ways of working and, tend to prioritise outputs and efficiency and timelines. And, we also really value those things, but equally is being relational and focusing on long-term outcomes for community and being grounded in trust. And so I think navigating that space and advocating for ways of working that reflects cultural values in these systems that don't always recognise or accommodate for them. So that's where I see that self-determination becomes really powerful, because you can lead your own work, you can build your own system, you can set the tone and define your priorities and define what success looks like.
Absolutely, and I think like what you're talking about there is something we believe in really strongly as well, as like working at that speed of trust.
Yeah.
And community pace, and not being driven by these outside figures that, where do they even come from? But why are we imposing them on others? It's not fair.
100%.
It's not right. So looking at practical change and turning knowledge into action now, CC, you have worked on making markets safer and more inclusive for women with disabilities. What practical changes have made the biggest difference in helping women participate more fully and confidently in market life?
Thank you, Renee. So I guess this project, the Markets for Change project, was actually it actually happened to enable women with disabilities in the Pacific to be able to participate in I guess selling their goods in the markets, which they were not able to do before because of inaccessibility issues. There were safety issues that were at play, security, because of sometimes it was so overcrowded that their safety was in jeopardy. There was no accessible washrooms also in the markets. So taking these concerns into consideration, this project came around where the UN Women worked with the municipal councils and the OPDs in Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Fiji to build or make existing markets more safer and accessible for women with disabilities. So by making these changes, women were much more empowered to go in and participate in these activities, which they were not able to do before. The enabling space where they could easily move around with minimum barriers to their movements, enabling having a space to go and a safe place where they could access washrooms which were accessible, and also the locations where they could go and do shopping on their own, where there were supermarkets beside the markets. This was something that they couldn't do before, where they had to depend on family members to do these activities for them. So this in itself was quite empowering because they have the autonomy and the independence to do all these duties on their own. So, and also the spaces made it possible for them to have their own tables where they could sell their produce and where they did not have to worry about people encroaching into their space or pushing them out of their space because of not enough space for everyone. So there was a dedicated space where they could sell their produce and have their own art and or craft which they could sell.
That's fantastic and so practical and so meaningful. Thanks so much for sharing with us. So looking to you now, Jess, you work across research, policy and community engagement. What helps turn community knowledge and lived experience into changes that institutions will actually listen to and act on?
Thank you. Yes. So I work for a university and I kind of wear two hats. I have a professional role, but I also have my academic role. And in my professional role, my job is essentially to have eyes across the different Indigenous research that's happening across the university, and which can range from, you know, looking at high level strategic goals for Indigenous research right across to ethics side of stuff, and having to sometimes tap researchers on the shoulder and say, I've heard some not so great things from community about your work, that kind of thing. So, and there are some people that are doing the right thing, and there's obviously some people that are definitely not. And research traditionally, and even sometimes today, has been very extractive for Indigenous communities. And I think some institutions are doing a really good job at addressing that and trying to put things in place to ensure that doesn't happen. And that's part of my job at Monash, is to kind of put those things in place and push different areas of the university to put those things in place. And like what we were talking about before actually was the fact that some institutions are very open to that, and they're proactive in providing resourcing. My job, for instance, providing those resources and pathways to have people in place to make those changes. But there's a lot of institutions out there too that just won't do that. So I think there's two sides to it. I think you can put things in place at an institutional level to ensure that, in my experience, researchers are doing the correct thing and they're ensuring that their engagement with community is done in a respectful way, and what their research is co-developed and all those kinds of things. But that's also, to me, very tick box approach. And there's nothing worse when you read an ethics application and you just know that they've just ChatGPT'd it, and put it in the application and hope the community are just like, yeah, that sounds nice, let's tick that off. And so I think it's then that educational piece for people that work in institutions, and really providing the education around why these things are put in place. And it's really sad because we shouldn't have to keep explaining ourselves, but we do. And so just pushing the status quo a little bit in institutions to allow that to happen and keep banging on the right doors and getting those things moving. But it is quite challenging. It can be very frustrating when sometimes you do hit a wall all the time. But yeah, I do, especially younger people. I think I'm still young, but people that are younger than me. I say to them too, especially like young Indigenous people, it does get tiring and exhausting to keep having to bang on that door of, we need to make these structural changes and these, but you've just got to keep doing it. And I think it's not about Indigenous people obviously fitting into institutions, it's about institutions changing their ways of doing things to fit Indigenous people. And so, another thing too, in terms of my space in research, we talk a lot about non-traditional outputs and in academia, and allowing Indigenous researchers to express their research in different ways that might not get them a promotion, unfortunately, but having that avenue. But at the same time, I'm a very big advocate for getting Indigenous people into that mainstream way of doing research, because once they're in there, they can actually start making the changes. So really supporting the younger academic community, Indigenous community, really just get in there. So once they're in there, they can really start, ruffling some feathers. Yeah.
Beautiful, thank you. And I guess even challenging moving to a point where institutions are working by invitation as well. Rather than thinking that they're going to be invited, like just can go in.
Just rock up.
Yeah. Please don't just rock up. We don't like it. So looking forward, Elaine, you've worked on procurement access and place-based development. What needs to change so that Indigenous women-led enterprises are not just included, but are able to shape local economies and communities on their own terms?
I honestly think the shift that we need is, not being brought in at the end. We need to be brought in from the beginning and also have some shared decision making. We need to be included in that decision making. A lot of current approaches are all about inclusion. We'll give you a seat at the table. You can be our blackface, so on and so forth. But those are opportunities that are being provided when, the frameworks and all the decisions have been made and they're not genuine, we know that. So shaping local economies, it means different things. It means, being part of how things are procured, defining what that, value is, not only to the business, but, to the community, because it's not just about us. It's not just about the individual, it's about, the community and intergenerational wealth. What we've seen is when those decisions are made, real outcomes really do occur. So I think those are the changes that are needed.
Thank you. And as a lot of systems still talk about capacity building. From your perspective, what needs to change so the focus shifts from building Indigenous women's capacity to backing their authority, their decision making, and control over resources?
Yeah, that's a good one. Because I think that language kind of assumes that there's something lacking with Indigenous women. When, you know, in reality, there's so much capability and leadership and expertise. So it's not that that doesn't exist, it's just that the systems aren't set up to recognise it or support it or resource it properly. And I think like that's something that has been quite clearly articulated through the work of the Wiyayani Change Agenda for First Nations Gender Justice, because the focus needs to shift from trying to fix our women to actually transforming the systems around us. So yeah, I think it's about redesigning systems and structures, not people. So instead of, I guess, expecting us to fit into these frameworks and ways of working, we need things that are more culturally responsive, more flexible, and built in ways that reflect our realities as well. Because for us, I think a really strong reality is that we're constantly walking in two worlds, and we're holding our cultures and our knowledge and our responsibilities to family and community. But at the same time, we're navigating these systems that were never designed for us. And so we're constantly having to adapt, which is really quite exhausting. So I think some of the systems need to start doing the work too. A lot of them are quite rigid and built around, you know, timelines and strict processes and narrow definitions of what success looks like, and also how you get to success. But Indigenous-led work doesn't just neatly fit into those structures, and it requires time to build relationships and engage with community and work in ways that are grounded in cultural values. And I think an important part of this is the access to resources and decision-making power, because often funding is controlled by large institutions or it goes through intermediaries, and then Indigenous women are brought in later and we're expected to deliver on somebody else's design or, you know, framework. But to be serious about self-determination, that really needs to shift. I think we need direct access to resources, we need authority to decide how resources are used, and not just be implementing things that have already been predetermined. And I think it also links to recognition as well, because many Indigenous women have diverse education and career pathways and have built experience through, you know, work and community leadership and practice. And those forms of knowledge aren't always recognised in mainstream systems. And I think for me, something that has really stuck with me is a conversation that I had a couple of years ago with in a professional context with someone who were kind of just having a chat, and they were like, oh, would ever like to do a second master's? This is a really good course. And it just kind of struck me because at the time I didn't even have a bachelor's, but I was doing well in my work and I was managing, you know, really big projects. And I think they assumed that for me to have gotten to that place in my career, I must have gone through, you know, a formal institution. And it made me sad that they didn't see that for me, I had got to this place because of my family and my community and the, you know, elders that had passed on knowledge and those that had come before me, and all of this like community strength is what had got me into those rooms. And I just thought, oh, wouldn't it be lovely if that was the assumption of how you get there instead of, you know, my education. And it's just
Pieces of paper, right?
Yeah, and it's been something I've never spoken about because I was like, until I got that piece of paper, I wasn't going to let anyone know. But I think it's really important, yeah, to think about how we define people's paths and their experience, like how we value that.
Absolutely, and we heard it on, I believe it was Tuesday, we carry the strength of our ancestors and the future of our children and all that we do. But while we are looking forward, and shortly we will move to questions, so start getting them ready. Cece, to you, as we look to the future, what new or underexplored approaches could strengthen the economic leadership of women with disabilities in the Pacific?
I think going forward, one of the first things that we could do was, I was just thinking about it, establish a pool of women with disabilities who are economic leaders or are currently working in this field, who can become mentors and technical advisors to help other women with disabilities who would like to come into the space. I think this is one area which is we do not have anyone at the moment, but there are a lot of women out there who are already doing good work and who have established businesses that are successful, who can help and mentor other women. The second way I was thinking about it last night was the Pacific is made up of culturally, it's made up of extended families and small communal families who live together. And one good way we could encourage women with disabilities to become good leaders in economic activities is to establish cooperatives. The cooperatives will help them work together. It will establish good kinship between the women in working towards a common goal, and it will also help them in their leadership skills, especially in getting their cooperative to work. And the other one too I was thinking of is, and the final one was, most of the time most of our women do not really succeed in their economic endeavors because maybe we are just given the opportunity, given seed money to do work with and establish our business maybe, and then as it goes, there are other demands that come through from families and from traditional or cultural events that may be taking place that delve into our business, which makes it not work. So I was thinking it'll be good if there's standards or systems put in place for continuous mentoring and monitoring as soon as these projects are started, until like a hand-holding stage, until it is well and truly established and running well, then we can stop, and then they can the women can run it on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, Cece, what you're saying there is like so valuable, because not only is it recognizing the like practical solutions, but also the cultural needs that we have that do sometimes need to take some precedence when we're trying to engage in markets and economies and businesses. So thank you for your perspectives. We'll move to some questions now. And just very kindly, if you could please introduce yourself, where you're from, and please let us know which speaker your question is going to be directed towards. That will help us move through. We've got about 15 minutes to go through the questions, and then we will wrap up there so people can go get some lunch. But let's keep the yarn going, and pop your hand up, and Lisa will come around with a mic for you. So who's up first? Yes.
I'm Lisa Gonzalez. I work with a local government, and this is a very challenging topic for us as a local government. So my question is around, how do we engage meaningful and with local First Nations, but particularly with women in a way that we not seen as tokenistics, or that we are using the knowledge or taking advantage of First Nations. We are very slow in the process to the journey to reconciliation, but at the same time, we are conscious that the movement that we gonna take has to respect that. And we want, and obviously the right for self-determination. So it is, I have to put a lot of things around in local government, because if there is a lot of risk, there is a lot of fear, and it's, there is good intentions, but at the same time, it's a lot of fear of doing something wrong and completely destroy the relationships.
Yeah, good question. I think like a lot of the work I actually do is developing frameworks for organisations that are looking to be much more intentional and culturally safe and engage in their programs, and at that kind of starting point and think about how do they do that. And a big part of that is understanding, I think, the history and the context of the communities that you're engaging with, and particularly, you know, on a broader scale, but the place-based, you know, local community too. And looking at what's come before in terms of programs, looking who is there in community, who you're working with. And I think then looking at where there's alignment and you can be mutually beneficial, because I think there's a lot of organisations or institutions that are kind of like, oh, we want to do this, but are not thinking about the benefit for community or what community would want. And so I think spending time and building in long timelines and budgets with resourcing to actually spend the time meeting and yarning and being open to many different types of engagement and being flexible in that too, I think is really important. And not having a predetermined idea of where you want something to go, because the things you might hear from community might be completely at odds with what you were thinking, and so you've got to be prepared to change that. I think that's a really important starting point.
Just to add on to what Alice was saying, local government and other, you know, government bodies need to change their focus from, you know, it being a transactional relationship to it being a trust building journey with when they're out there dealing with community. You know, there is no timeline on developing trust. There is no timeline or set standards and definitions of what you're going to be able to achieve. So, you know, if you're out there dealing with community and trying to engage with communities, just like Alice said, don't go out there with perceived, you know, timelines, resources, biases. Expect to go on a journey, and a very insightful journey.
And I think on that too, in terms of academia, I get asked all the time, how can I go and talk to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community? And it's all about relationships, as we know. It's literally all about relationships, and it's about doing a little bit of research about yourself, about what the community is like, what was just mentioned, but also being really specific about who you actually talk to in that community, but also realising too that community themselves have different things going on, and that you might not always talk to the best person, and being really aware of that. And then I think it goes to as well in terms of just being transparent, being honest and being consistent. There's nothing worse than when you say, yes, we're going to be here on this date. Does that work for you? Yep. You don't show up, or you're going to change the date, or you don't pay them, or, you know, that kind of thing. Just being really clear about that. And, you know, just from a legal point of view, I always say to community, you need to have research agreements, or you need to have legally binding documents in place about your engagement, because there's nothing worse than when someone goes out and promises, yep, we're going to have food here and, you know, we're going to provide transport into here, and they don't follow through with any of that. But if you have it in a document that's been co-developed with that community, then there's that kind of thing that the community can fall back on. And the other thing too, which when I speak to communities, they get really frustrated around as well, is that a lot of people come to them and don't explain anything. It's like they expect community to have knowledge about how these policies and how all this stuff works, and they don't have that knowledge, nor should they have to go and seek that expertise themselves if you're the one that wants to engage with them. So also providing them those resources as well is really important.
I get tired of community information, get tired of all the consultation. Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, great. That is another thing we hear a lot in research, is that communities say, oh, well, I've had like 5 universities approach us. And so something that we're really interested in helping community with as well, which a lot of advisory groups have started doing in Australia, is these research prospectuses, which you provide resources to community to sit around and kind of talk about what they kind of want and what their needs are and what they would like addressed. And the idea of it is that this is a document out there, and that if a researcher comes across it, if their research expertise doesn't align at all with what's in that research prospectus, then they can't even reach out to the community. So it's kind of like a step before, because yes, they get inundated all the time. I know one community I'm working with, they have a research prospectus, but before that, they would just they had to hire someone to do their admin, because they were constantly, because they're part of a huge national park, they were constantly being inundated with it, you know, emails from different unis. And they chose us too because relationships, one of our researchers on our team is part of that mob. So again, it's a relationship thing.
Always, when we talked about it 2 years when AFNAG was launched, it was relationships before business. I'll never forget that one. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Matthew. I'm with ACFID. Thanks for everything that you've shared today. All of you pointed in different ways to the systems that need to be changed or that are, you know, part of the problem. Do you have some examples of things you've been involved with where you see positive levers for systems change? You know, what are the things that actually, in your experience, help to change those systems?
I think I might go first. I think, well, from my perspective, we've seen a lot of programs come and go, a lot of governments, you know, so we're going to implement this based on their priorities, their short term, short, sharp, sweet, they don't work. I think what works, and it's not essentially involving a system, it's navigating a way around the system, is when we've recently asked Aboriginal women what they want out of a program. What do they need? And they've provided us the answers. They want a capability building program that incorporates a number of elements with a number of access points. And so it's, you know, finding the grey area within the policy, which I'm amazing at, to be able to work within that system and utilise that grey area to be able to develop something that's long term, that outlasts government cycles. So I guess it's the grey area and the unwritten things that you can essentially negotiate within the system that works, in my based on my experience.
Yeah, for me, something I've seen work really well that is also really frustrating is getting people to trust us to do things our ways. And I guess part of that is advocating for, you know, the reason behind why we need longer timelines or why we need more flexibility with funding or why we've got to adapt processes. But for me, it's come down to when people in positions of power actually say, okay, that's a really different way of doing it, but go ahead, we're going to resource that, we're going to fund that, we'll give you the timelines to do it. And that's when I see really good change happening, when people in those positions are trusting and open to it, because maybe the larger scale system at the time is not ready for that change, or it's really rigid. And, you know, like I do quite a work with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and it's a very, very big government department. But when there's people within it that are willing to trust you to do things differently, and that little section, then you see things, the outcomes are better, there's better, you know, much more impactful projects, and then other people see it and then they start to trust you. And then, you know, now we're kind of years down the track and I'm starting to then see the systems shift, because people are reflecting and saying, oh, it actually works really well. Like, yeah, let's do it that way. And so then the change happens. But so I think it's also individual people in their positions, listening to Indigenous voices and letting us lead on our terms.
Any other questions before we perhaps go to lunch? Okay, I might, yeah, that's okay. I used to work in a school, so I know I've got a big voice. I'm used to wrangling everyone like a herd of cats. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a very frank discussion, and I'm not surprised. I'm really delighted that our speakers have been so forthcoming with their views, and Cici in particular, the practical solutions that you're providing to our audience today are so valuable. And I'm not going to say what the top 3 takeaways I think you should walk out with, because I believe in self-determination. So I imagine you've enjoyed the discussion, and everybody has a different lived experience. So you will take many different things away, and I hope that you share them with the people that are around you, because this knowledge is absolutely incredible, and there's no way to put a price or a timeline on how we can use and implement it. So thank you very much. And again, thank you to First Australians Capital, ACFID and the RDI Network for bringing this panel together today, for having me here. I really appreciate you supporting different and diverse voices who have some really valuable and robust discussions that I imagine we will continue out over lunch. So again, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day and the conference. Probably it's almost over already. And Walawani, I hope you have travelled here safely, and I hope that you travel safely back to your home. Thank you.